Excited that you were able to give us some time on this holiday weekend.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to talk to you guys.
Karen, let's just get right to it. Why this book and why this book now?
Well, I didn't think that there was a book that was, actually directed at trainers except for handicapping books that the Racing Form really had published. So I thought there was a need for this. And being a daughter of a trainer, that was just sort of in my wheelhouse, was to write a book about trainers. And so I thought it had a good place in the market.
Karen,
Yeah.
what would you say about your book, The Training Game, is different than the traditional stuff that you mentioned, handicapping angles and that sort of thing? What makes your book stand out from some of the others on the market?
Well, I think it gives an inside look at the operations of these different trainers, and they're very different. Todd Pletcher's in the book, Steve Asmussen's in the book. They're trainers that have, 200 to 300 horses in their operation. And then there's somebody like Neil Howard who trains for Will Ferrish. He has a private training job, which is really sort of unique in today's, climate of racing. So the approaches of those men to what they do with their operation on a daily basis is so different. And I think that gives a glimpse to, racing fans, handicappers, might get a behind-the-scenes look at what goes on in the barn.
Certainly they have distinctions, but successful people or people who are successful in a particular industry generally do a lot of similar things. So I'd ask you that. How are their operations, from your perspective, somewhat similar in their dealing with their stock, with their owners, and so on?
Well, I think that the question about the owners, that's, interesting. No matter if you train for, one person or if you train for 50 people, you have an obligation to these owners to put your best foot forward as well as try to keep them happy. In the case of somebody like Todd Pletcher, he's going to have a lot of owners who may have horses that are going for one spot. And, owners don't necessarily want to be running against other horses in the trainer's stable. So Todd has to become very, diplomatic on that front. And, he says that generally he just tries to find the best spot for the horse. And if that means running multiple horses in one race, so be it. And then he'll just have to deal with the owners on that issue. Neil Howard, he is just training for one person. And, it's a breeder he trains for. So he's just now getting horses that are homebreds, and he's not going to sales and getting to pick horses like Todd does in many instances. So even though you have to please the owner, there's different ways of doing it depending upon the operation.
Karen, you mentioned Neil Howard and how he's kind of an anomaly these days. The trainer that works for a private stable, an owner breeder and that sort of thing. Can you describe a little bit about how the 8 trainers that you wrote about, how their operations vary? In brief, do they deal with a lot of stable managers? Are trainers like Alan Jerkins, more or less likely to, pay attention to what the advisors say? A little bit of that inside baseball kind of thing.
Well, I think somebody like Alan Jerkins, very old school, and I don't think he really cottons to the fact of having racing managers. And I think that the owners that have horses with Alan understand that Alan wants to run the show and he wants to call the shots. Now, somebody like Todd Pletcher, there are a lot of racing managers involved. I mean, he trains for Michael Tabor and, so many high-profile owners, let's say, that do have racing managers in the organization. So I think Todd has to, come to terms with that, and there's maybe more people that a Todd Pletcher or a Steve Asmussen would have to deal with on a daily basis than, let's say, Alan Jerkins, who would just deal directly with the owner. And, in some ways, I would imagine that it makes life easier when you don't have a middleman and you can just, directly, have contact with the owner.
And, we're probably remiss, Karen, we didn't mention to our audience that, your father is the Hall of Fame trainer, Phil Johnson. I had the great good fortune of serving on a panel with him once at the Saratoga Racing Museum and Hall of Fame. And you know, your father, I think it would be safe to say, was part of that old school along with Alan Jerkins.
Absolutely. When I think of old school, I think of my dad, and I mean, they were, trained side by side, and actually were great friends. And there's not many men left, that come from that era and have been around for as long as Alan. Alan turned 80 about a month ago, and he's still training and training well, and has a nice stable.
Well, Karen, the reason that I brought it up is, if I remember correctly, and please, set me straight if I'm wrong. It strikes me that one of the reasons that your dad entered Volpone in the 2002 Breeders' Cup Classic was not only did he have a talented and fit racehorse, but as I recall, he was a little bit, maybe not critical, but he didn't think some of the other trainers were bringing their horses up to the Classic in the right way. They were either coming off layoffs, or maybe the training was too light for a 1.25 mile race against the best horses in the country. Is my memory correct, or what can you tell?
No, you're absolutely right, and I think that that's something that's brought up in Alan Jerkins' chapter in my book, where he's earned the name Giant Killer for his upset, including Secretariat. And I think what Alan said was he really tried to scope out the competition in races, particularly when he beat Secretariat in the Whitney at Saratoga. Now I'm forgetting, was it Pruvat or Onion?
Pruvat.
You help me here. Okay, and he said that he was watching Secretariat train for that race, and he didn't really like what he saw. He thought that Secretariat was a bit of a tired horse after running in the Triple Crown and then going out and running at Arlington Park, and he thought he was vulnerable. And I think that was kind of what my dad was thinking when he entered horses, and particularly Volpone in that big race where he was going to be a long shot, was maybe this was the right opportunity to pick off some of these horses who might not be coming into the race at their best.
Yeah, Karen, in talking about your dad and the old school, there's a part of me that believes that institutional memory should never be lost and needs to be passed on. And I think much of what you have in this book, especially with Alan Jerkins and I think with Nick Zito, and Carl Nafka is passing on some of that institutional memory. You talked to Pletcher, Asmussen, Bobby Frankel, Dutrow. And they all talk about their level of success and the road to success. But with success comes the sniping and the jealousy, and we are in the age of medication. And I thought that you asked the right question, and they were quite forthcoming with you in the book. But could you just talk about the interview when you touched on medication in today's context?
Sure. I mean, you're right. They were very forthcoming with me, and I think that they almost expected that question to be asked of them. And, I mean, the one thing that I took away from this is the majority of these trainers, if not all these trainers in the book, are really pushing for, a uniform medication rule. Because right now, each state has different rules as to what you can use, what the withdrawal time is, what the penalties are if there are a contamination case, let's say, where there's something that lingers in the system longer than it should. And I think that all of them feel that it's necessary that, the industry gets behind this issue and does something that makes it easier on these trainers. Because let's say you're an Asmussen or you're a Todd Pletcher. You have so many horses in your stable. They're running in so many different locales. And, the trainer just has to be on top of, what the rules and regulations in terms of medications are in each of the states that they're participating in.
Karen, you mentioned the medication subject, and we would be remiss, since our audience are mostly racing fans, bettors, people like that. One of the common perceptions among a segment of our viewing audience is that improper use of medication is rampant in thoroughbred racing, and several trainers have been labeled as super trainers, and their winning percentage is too good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do horsemen share that view, or do horsemen have a different view of how the medication game is now, other than what you mentioned, the uniform rules and that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, I think that, off the record, there were some things that were said to me, and because they're off the record, I wouldn't necessarily share.
Sure.
But I guess my general, the consensus would be that, yeah, there are people that take an unfair advantage, but there are people that are playing by the rules. And, the people that I profiled in this book, they have had medication violations and have been suspended. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they had done something wrong. It could have been an administrative mess up where a vet gave a horse a shot by mistake or by virtue of not giving enough out time. So yeah, I think that the public perception is that, there are things that are going on in racing that are not necessarily good, but I think the industry, is trying to take steps now to rectify that. One of the things that Todd Pletcher touched on was the whole public perception of steroids. And, for, let's say, the casual racing fan, when they heard the word steroids and horses, they were thinking of, the people in Major League Baseball that were offenders, and
Right.
that, that was something that was going to, really improve a horse's performance. And as Todd was explaining to me, the reason that, he had been using steroids, and which he doesn't anymore, and it stopped way in advance of them becoming illegal, was for recovery time, that, the stress of racing on horses, it takes a bit out of these animals, and the steroids sort of, give them a good appetite, and it speeds their recovery between races. And so I thought that was interesting that, he said that, if steroids were going to be around forever, the public were always going to associate it as being a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. One last question on this particular topic, Karen, then I'll throw you back to Tom. You've been a horse owner, you've been a reporter, your father is a legendary trainer who's in the Hall of Fame. Some people have suggested the way to solve the problem is to, if it could be done, which is, almost impossible, would be go back to no race day medication, hay, oats, and water, no Lasix, no anything else on race day. How would you as a horse owner feel about that? How do some of the people that you've spoken to feel about that notion? Is it forget about whether it's doable or not, is it unrealistic from the standpoint of what's best for the horse?
Well, why would it be unrealistic if they do that in Europe and they do that in Dubai? And, we have horses, certainly many American horses go over to Dubai and they perform well, as we've seen over the years.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it is doable. And, I'm not so sure about the elimination of Lasix. Some people believe that could be used as a masking agent, that,
Right.
You're not just treating it for a bleeder, but, so you could put other drugs. I can't really speak to that because I'm not a vet, but, I mean, there is hemorrhaging horses have as the result of stress of racing. And so, I think that the more that you give the Lasix to, then it just, ends up that then the horse does need it more and more. I don't know if we could get away from that. But, I mean, Todd even said in his chapter, maybe the only way to, do this is just, stop all race day medication and, to do something like Europe is doing. And,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those horses run well.
Karen, just 2 points from your text, and then we'll let you go. You talk about it at the top of the show. You said that there wasn't, most of the literature on trainers was handicapping information. And I think that you've got 2 pieces of excellent information here. And these trainers do talk a little bit about their methodologies. But there's an excellent section where Todd Pletcher talks about how he views workouts and what aspect of a workout is important to him. And I think that would be a point of interest to readers of